Welcome to a new episode of Israel at War. I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, and with me I have Michael Berenbaum, who is the director of the Sigi Ziering Institute and a professor of Jewish Studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. So first, Michael, give us an up-to-the-minute report of what's going on in Israel.
Well, I think it's important to say that at this moment, we're in the 38th day since the horrific days of October 7th. At this moment, two monumentally important or two significant things happened today. The first is we had a massive march on Washington. The numbers exceed 200,000. The numbers I've heard are 290,000. If it's 290,000, it's literally 5% of the American Jewish community.
Wow.
Has showed up.
I listened for the whole 3.5 hours on a Zoom, but I hadn't realized it was that much of a percentage. So wow.
If it's that, it's 5% of the American Jewish community. And the last time we had a march of this size, it was a bit larger. It was a march for Soviet Jewry in December of 1987, just on the verge of the meeting between President Gorbachev and the Soviet leader Gorbachev and President Reagan. And we didn't want glasnost to come at the expense of the freedom for Soviet Jewry. And the historical results of that were monumental, meaning we got both glasnost. Something that could not be conceived of that time was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberation of Soviet Jewry, who then were able to make their way to either Israel or the free world. So it was a tremendous occasion. We had months to organize that rally. There were days to organize this rally, and the American Jewish community and its friends showed up. I understand the speeches were eloquent.
Yes,
and the only reason I was not there is because I'm leaving for Israel within hours, and I could not arrange my ticket to leave from Washington. In fact, we are leaving for Israel via Athens because our airline is not flying all the way to Israel. We'll switch over to El Al once we get to Athens. The second thing, which may be decisive in a very different way, and the second thing that's happening at this moment is that Israel has entered the Shefa hospital compound and is going there with the idea that it's going to attack the military infrastructure that is under the Shefa hospital. And we are soon going to know the degree to which Israel intelligence and American intelligence, which has backed up Israel intelligence, have been accurate in the depiction of Shefa Hospital, not only as a hospital, but as a military installation. And presuming that that is correct, and I do presume that's correct, that does several things. First of all, it shows the degree to which Hamas is guilty of a war crime, because installing a military infrastructure within recognized civilian infrastructures is literally a war crime. It shows that Israel has not been attacking the hospital for naught. It also shows that the Hamas Health Service has had a great problem telling the truth, which is another polite or maybe not so polite way of saying they've been lying through their teeth when they said they did not. There was no military infrastructure underneath. They've also apparently also been lying under their lying throughout when they indicated that the nature of the supplies and the nature of the shortages and the refusal of Israel to provide resources to keep the hospital. Israel is apparently helping in the evacuation of the hospital, and we will know within hours or at the most within a day or two the degree to which Hamas has been complicitous in using the hospital, and therefore using using not only the hostages as human shields, but their own population as human shields, taking the resources away from it. There was an interesting discussion this evening on CNN, in which Anderson Cooper said it was remarkable that there were no bomb shelters erected to provide for the civilian population. Everybody in Israel has, quotation marks, a safe room. If you drive along the highway, there are shelters provided in case of rockets, and Israel takes care of its civilian population to the best that it can. Obviously, it failed dramatically, significantly, substantially, in every conceivable way. It failed on October 7th, and the consequences of that will be seen in the shape of the government in the aftermath. It essentially means that Hamas, as we suspect, Hamas has been using its civilian population as a shield and hoping that there would be a very high casualty rate that would shift the blame for that casualty rate onto Israel and would press Israel for a ceasefire. Let's go through for our listeners a couple of things. There are a couple of elements that are being offered that we have to pay attention to. Number one is the request for a ceasefire. Let's recall there was a ceasefire on October 6th. Hamas broke that ceasefire on October 7th. And the request for a ceasefire now is to say that Hamas should be allowed to attack Israel, inflict massive casualties. The number of casualties inflicted on Israel were inflicted on the United States, where its population proportionate, is the equivalent of 40,000 Americans being killed. We lost 3,000 Americans, 2,900 and somewhat on 9/11. And Israel, which has 10 million compared to our 325, 340 million, you can do the figures and you can understand the nature of the losses when 1,400 Israelis, or maybe 1,200 Israelis and 240 Israelis are taken captive. This is a massive number. That ceasefire was broken. Hamas then wants to be able to attack. And when the pressure comes on it to say, we want a humanitarian ceasefire, which essentially means that they remain undisturbed and their rule remains as it is. So that's where we are at this moment in the war. I have to tell you something that I'm writing right now, which may disturb some in the audience. I'm writing a piece which begins like this: only a confirmed anti-Semite could believe that the people of Israel have the government they deserve.
Mm.
And that means that there have been a series of stupid remarks, policies, deeds, and the like taken by the Israeli government that just should not be allowed. And if Israel had a government that was really operating, it would not be allowed. Among them, let me give you an example. One minister suggested the use of nuclear weapons, which is A, a panic move, B, a foolish move, because nuclear weapons would not only destroy Gaza, but would also act back on the Israeli population, which lives in proximity to Gaza, and give it radiation poisoning. Israel's Minister of Finance is withholding payments to the Palestinian Authority, which is a move that is breathtakingly stupid, because we don't want a second front to a fourth front, or even a fifth front, because there's now action on the Lebanese border, there's action with Syria, there's action with Hamas.
Michael, can you explain to our audience that those payments would go to the West Bank? When you say Palestinian,
those payments would go to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and would pay the salaries of the civil servants. And the last thing we want at this moment is unrest in the West Bank.
Okay,
That
thank you.
means there must be a clamping down on settlers. And there were, in fact, 8 elements of the Israeli military that was moved to the West Bank away from Gaza before the war to deal with the crisis of the behavior of the interaction between settlers and Palestinians living in the vicinity. So the idea of heating it up is just enormously foolish. We also had somebody brag that this is a second Nakba, not realizing that the world has a great deal of sympathy for the first Nakba. And
But
Israel is
Michael, you need to explain that to our listeners.
Nakba is the Palestinian word, the Arabic word for the events of the events of Israel Independence Day, which essentially
In
was
1948.
for in 1948, which was for the Palestinians a sense of loss and a sense of what they accuse Israel of ethnic cleansing. One does not suggest that you want to inflict that on any population. Now, let me make the second point, which is equally true. Only a confirmed anti-Semite would believe that the people of Palestine have the government and the ruling authorities that they deserve. Because what's imperative ultimately is that Israel live with its neighbors, and its neighbors are going to be Palestinians. There are 7 million Israeli Jews. There are 3 million Arabs on the West Bank, Palestinians, 2 million in Gaza. That means a 7 million, 5 million type of thing. 20% of Israel's population is Arab Israelis who are proud citizens of Israel and who have been, relatively speaking, quiet and peaceful, and who have no desire to change their citizenship, even if they sympathize with Palestinian nationalism. And why do I say that only a confirmed anti-Semite believes that? Because ultimately the government in Gaza has been inflicting casualty after casualty after casualty on Israel, and casualty after casualty after casualty, with its total disregard of the citizens of Gaza. Had the opportunity since 2007, when it assumed rule, had the opportunity to create, Israel is not occupying Gaza,
Exactly.
had the opportunity to create an economically viable, comfortable existence for the people of Gaza, used instead all of those resources for military purposes. And the government in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, which has been weak, corrupt, old, and without much credibility, is also not a government that is capable of leading its people into a better time. Part of that fault is with the Palestinians, and part of that fault is that the right-wing government of Israel has been weakening the Palestinian Authority, and that's deeply problematic. So what can we say at the 38th day of the war? Number one, it's a long war. In fact, it now is moving into one of the longest wars in Israel's history. Number two, Israel is moving slowly, deliberately. There have been casualties on the Israeli side, but not in the numbers that were feared, which means that it's a planned activity that is going along with a disciplined manner. The hostages are still hostages, and we will know very shortly the degree to which the Hamas has been committing war crimes on its own population, and also the degree to which people like the hospital official and the Hamas Palestinian Health Service have just been lying through their teeth and misleading the world. And again, if Israel is mistaken in its intelligence, we will know that. If Israel is accurate in its intelligence and the United States is accurate in its intelligence, then we will understand the brutal necessity of what's been occurring over the last 35 days. Nobody that I know wants the type of casualties that have been inflicted, but this is a war, and they may be, what shall we say, they may be the casualties of war, not a war that Israel chose to start, a war that was imposed on Israel. And again, when you say from the river to the sea, as we hear in all of these demonstrations, that means the eradication of Israel. And if it's up to Hamas, it means the annihilation of its Jewish population, 7 million Jews living in the area that is from the river to the sea. And if you say ceasefire, you're asking for a Palestinian, for a Hamas victory, and you're not worried about the hostages. And we are worried about the hostages, who have every reason, and most especially civilian hostages, who have every reason to come home. And again, some of the hostages are children,
Babies.
babies, one 6-month-old baby, one 3-year-old toddler, a 3-year-old child whose parents were killed and who then was taken as a hostage. One is an Israeli whose arm was blown off, happens to be a young man that is a nephew of one of my closest friends. So these are people that we know. And again, we have to say the Red Cross has not had access to them. We have no accounting of the numbers. We have no accounting of the names. We have no accounting on the conditions under which they live. So this is a horrific situation and one that is painful. But within hours, we will know a lot more of the scope and the scale of the deception of Hamas.
I want to do 2 footnotes to what you just said. Today, when I got the Washington Post 7 headlines that I get every day, I was very upset and wrote to them and did it on Twitter that the very first one quoted how many Palestinians have been killed in Gaza and said, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, without adding the words, which is controlled by Hamas, which drives me crazy.
Now, you have to also say controlled by Hamas is an important point, because people don't feel free to say what they know, because Hamas will inflict its punishment on them if they tell the truth.
The Washington Post has to worry about that?
The Washington Post, in fact, well, it may have to worry about some of its journalists being taken captive. It may also be used to, in journalism, and you know it as well as I, some of I'm a historian, which means I have to find evidence for what I say. In journalism, you very often merely have to find sources for what you say and quote them accurately. And then over time, the idea, it's the first turn of history. And over time, you figure out what they are saying and what its implications mean. So let's take an interesting example. We are still now talking about Israel's bombing of the hospital.
Not a different hospital.
Israel's bombing of the hospital. Number one, let's break that out. Number one, there was no bombing of the hospital. There was a rocket that went off in the parking lot adjacent to the hospital. It was not an Israeli rocket. It was a Palestinian rocket that was misfired.
Yes.
The number of casualties were said to have been 5,000. The number of casualties were said to have been 500.
500.
And one of the doctors said, well, it may have been 500, may have been 5,000. We don't know. And yet the press quotes that as if it's an accurate source. and an accurate accounting of the dead. This is not meant to minimize the number of dead in Gaza, but it's, remember, the Hamas could have predicted, anybody could have predicted, that if you kill that many Israelis, there will be this type of response. And they invited upon themselves a vigorous response that would kill its own population, hoping that so many would be killed, numbers that may be massively inflated, hopefully massively inflated, with the idea that that would put humanitarian pressure on the Israelis to cease and desist and to accept, quotation marks, a defeat, not because it doesn't have the power to act, but because it has the compassion not to act. And, I've said a couple of times on this show, the strength of Israel is its weakness, and the weakness of Israel is its strength. Let me repeat it, because it's a complex idea which I'm trying to express simply. The strength of Israel is its weakness, the weakness of Israel its strength. What do I mean? Israel seems like Goliath, therefore everybody roots for David. The powerless must have justice on their side, not the powerful. So that's the strength of Israel being its weakness. The weakness of Israel is its strength. Israel doesn't use the full power it has at its disposal because it's restrained, however brutal it looks from the air and the like. It's restrained in doing that because it wants to inflict a limited number of civilian casualties. It also doesn't want to endanger its own population and its own service members. And finally, it also has values which seek the return of the hostages. Therefore, it's restrained, however much it appears otherwise, it's restrained in its use of power. That's what I mean, that the weakness of Israel is its strength, its moral strength, and the strength of its humanistic values. That's not to support the government of Israel. That's not to support the idiocy that we're seeing. It's not to support those who have said, let's return to settlements in Gaza. It's not to support Benjamin Netanyahu, whom I believe will pay the ultimate price of losing power and being held accountable by a commission. It says essentially that this is the condition imposed on Israel by Hamas, and that's what we're experiencing today.
I want to say something about the 3.5 hours that I watched. Afterwards, what I thought was the most amazing difference is you didn't hear a single speaker talk about killing the enemy or that the Palestinian people were unimportant. Instead, they talked about the Palestinian people as opposed to Hamas being under the thumb of Hamas. And yet we've seen many pro-Palestinian rallies in the United States in which they literally say, kill the Jews. And to me, that was the most, if anyone really wants to understand the difference between Israel and Hamas, it was on view today, if that makes sense.
Well, we can also say that these were not necessarily pro-Palestinian rallies. They were pro-pogrom rallies, meaning yes. Pro the pogrom, in favor of the pogrom against the Jews. And the reason for that is that it's not clear that it's clear to me, but it's not clear to the Palestinian people that they are well served by Hamas. And somebody who roots for the Palestinian people, as I do, roots also for the demise of Hamas, so other forces can emerge from the Palestinian people who are interested in creating a different future for themselves and their children. Again, this could be the 23rd year of a Palestinian state. It could also be the 16th year of a Palestinian state. Both were available to Palestinian leadership. Twice the Palestinian leadership opted not to take it. And the whole reason for this war, long in planning, was to shatter the possibility of Israel achieving normalization with Saudi Arabia and therefore acceptance in the region. The radicals on both sides, Jews and most particularly Hamas and Hezbollah, and all of the Iranian proxies, want to destroy the possibility of Israelis gaining normal relations and mutual acceptance in the region, which would then force them to accept Israel because Israel could not be defeated. And they've been trying this for 75 years, and there's been a price to pay for that, and defeat after defeat after defeat. And let's see what this proposes. We will know much more within the next 72 hours.
Yes, you're talking about because of that, as that hospital is explored more and more. So before we move on to another topic, because I know that your time is limited, I just want to repeat something you said, having just read a survey, which I'm not going to quote exactly because I didn't memorize who it was, that 51% in particular survey really believe that that Israel still occupied Gaza without realizing that Israel left in 2005. Every time I bring that up, I say that my husband and I were literally on a mission the weekend that we were in Sderot. I know I mispronounced it probably, but we were right there when Israeli troops came south and brought all the Israeli settlers out of Gaza, and Israel gave Gaza totally back to the Palestinians, 2005. And I think we need to repeat that number constantly to push back.
It gave it back, including the enormously economic, productive hothouses
of Wolfson, right?
That were directed, and James Wolfenson, who was then either head of the World Bank or former head of the World Bank, personally raised the money to give the hothouses over. And the Palestinian population was so angry at Israel that it didn't want to accept lucrative hothouses that could have been an economic boon for Gaza. So it set them afire, set them aflame, so furious that it destroyed its own economic opportunity. And we have to remember this because that is part of what I mean by only an anti-Semite could believe, and an anti-Palestinian could believe, that the people of Palestine have the leadership that they deserve. I wish them much, much, much better. And that's absolutely pivotal. Israel has not had any settlers, anybody living in Gaza since 2005. That was a unilateral move that, remember, is 18 years ago. So if you believe that it's occupied by Israel, now Israel does control one of the major areas of interest, but Egypt also controls it, and Egypt also finds the leadership of Hamas abhorrent to their stability. So it's not only an Israeli siege or quarantine of Gaza, it's an Israeli and Egyptian quarantine because of the nature of the leadership of Hamas.
So Michael is going to go to Israel, and hopefully he will tune in from Israel to give us an update. But now I've asked him to close with one thing I heard him say recently that I feel very strongly about. And for those of you who know that Michael is a renowned Holocaust historian, and I want him to say a few words of what I heard him say on a webinar with a particular group in which he said Holocaust education needs to change after October 7th. So could you say a few words about that, please?
Well, Holocaust education, look, let me talk philosophically for one moment. There's a phrase that became a very popular song by the waters of Babylon. We sat and we wept as we remembered Jerusalem. The place from which you remember an event shapes how you remember it. We are now going to remember the Holocaust in a situation in which everybody's bandying about the word genocide. and a situation where Jewish vulnerability and anti-Semitism is a manifest reality in ways that before we could have said never again, said that with a measure of confidence. We now have to teach something else, and part of what we have to teach is, again, the inherent dignity of every human being, their right to life and liberty. We have to teach the notion of against bigotry and against prejudice, for tolerance and pluralism, for decency and democracy. And we have to do so in a broken world, in a world in which that is not easily understood by large segments of the population, and in which there is not consensus, even in the United States. I look at what I teach now, and it's interesting because I now have to spend time teaching what happened between 1919 and 1933. How is it that a democratic government becomes dysfunctional, polarized, and violent?
He's
And
talking
also
about the
how
Weimar Republic that took over after World War One.
that's the Weimar Republic. And how is it that that leads to an authoritarian, ultimately a totalitarian leadership? Also, we have to teach that it begins not with military action, it begins with words and with venom.
Yes.
And with hatred. And it begins with the disparaging of human beings and the targeting of human beings because of race, religion, gender, all of those things. So we have a much greater obligation. And I've been saying for the last several years that I was hoping that I could become irrelevant. I was hoping that what I know about this history could be something we look at in the past. And the sad, tragic element of my life is that I'm not irrelevant, but what I know has become more and more and more relevant, including my understanding of anti-Semitism, my understanding of genocide, my understanding of the Holocaust, and my understanding of the challenges faced by democracy as it seeks to preserve itself and deliver for its population, for its citizens. So I had a dream, which is that I would live in a world that I could bequeath to my children, in which their father became irrelevant. And I'm sad to say that I've despaired of that becoming a reality.
Yes, I don't think there's really very much hope for that becoming a reality.
And that's a tragic commentary on our world.
On the other hand, you have much to teach us so that those of us who don't know as much as you will be looking for the signs. As I told you before we started, I have been reading a lot. I am not a historian, but I've been reading a lot about Germany between 1919 and 1933, and I am concerned at some of the parallels that are happening now. And so Michael's knowledge is really important for all of us.
I'm deeply concerned as well. But I want to say one thing which is not going to make, I want to say one thing. This is not a Holocaust.
Yes, explain.
That doesn't mean
yes.
It's not serious. That does not mean it doesn't have absolute evil. It also means that the venom is a venom, but they don't have the capacity that Nazi Germany did. And they also, the Jewish people are changed. And I have to again commend the American people and its leadership for the way in which it's standing by Israel in a very important and a very significant way. Even today, as the events on Shiva Hospital are beginning, the spokesman for Admiral Kirby, the spokesman for the National Security Council, indicated that American intelligence backs and reinforces the intelligence of Israel. The statements of the president have been strong. The Secretary of State has been there. The Secretary of Defense has been there. The CIA chief has been there. It's been an incredible display of support for Israel, something we did not know and should not take for granted. And one of the tasks of the demonstration today in Washington, D.C., was to thank the administration and
Yes.
thank the bipartisan consensus in Congress, which has a couple of dissenters on the extreme progressive left and then on the isolationist right, but has a mainstream well of enormous support for Israel, enormous appreciation of Israel.
Yes, absolutely. As I watched the speakers, absolutely. And so we should be grateful. And as Americans, we really need to understand when we say prayers in synagogue for both our country, the United States, and Israel, how important it is to appreciate what the United States does for Israel. With that, I'm going to tell Michael to have a good trip. I hope that when he next checks in with us, he has more good news than bad news. Is that a realistic hope? And let's hope the hostages come home as soon as possible.
Bring them home. Bring them home.
Bring them home.
Thank you.